Action RPG enjoyers, welcome to the video. The Diablo 4 beta has been and gone, and in this video, I intend on helping you answer a question I am positive you are all asking yourselves. Am I attracted to Lilith? Yes, the answer is yes, and I am so okay with that. Jokes aside, the real question to ask is Diablo 4 going to be bad? Or whatever clickbait title I give this video to get you to click on it. My intent with this video, however, is to give you my perspective on the game and hopefully give you the details you need to help you make an informed decision on whether or not you should put down your hard-earned... Wait, how much? Okay, this could be a tough sell, but let's talk. Before we begin, it's important I make it clear that this isn't really a review, it's more of a first impressions. This is based on my playtime in the early access and open beta. We were restricted to a level cap of 25, and 2 of the classes didn't even have their specializations. So do, of course, bear that in mind, because at release, you may find that Act 2 and beyond and the late game and how the classes behave with their specializations could be completely different. Also, unique items, the Paragon boards, and other late game content such as Hell Tides were not available. I'm going to start with what is probably the most interesting thing in Diablo 4, and that's gameplay. Combat in Diablo 4 overall is incredibly satisfying. The animations are clean, the sound design is impactful. When you're a barbarian smashing a hammer into the head of a Carver demon, you feel like a barbarian smashing a hammer into the head of a Carver demon. When you're a necromancer wielding a giant phantom scythe like a maniac, you feel like a scythe-wielding maniac. Don't get me wrong. A few of the more basic skills can feel a little but the most part, the slaying of monsters and demons has never felt so good. I say this as someone that's played Diablo 1, 2, and 3, Torchlight 1 and 2, Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, and Last Epoch. Also Vulcan, but come on, we're not going to talk about Vulcan. Diablo 4's combat has the best combat and game feel that I have ever experienced in an action RPG, culminating in an exceptional gameplay experience. In Diablo 4, Blizzard have taken a slightly different spin on the genre and moved to an open world format, not too dissimilar to Lost Ark. You run around an overworld with somewhat seamless transitioning from one zone to another. I say somewhat seamless as there is a little bit of rubber banding and you can sometimes see where the border is to the subzones you're in. It's not something you can physically see, but on a couple of occasions, namely at the northeastern exit of the main town in the first zone, you would just hit an invisible wall and be forced to exit the town via one of its other exits. Occasionally, you could be running from one subzone to another with another random player at your side, only to have them disappear into the ether as they were loaded into another server or shard, as players have come to call it. It's not a huge deal, and I imagine it's something that could be smoothed out by release, but it's a little immersion breaking, especially when running towards a social hub or world boss or event. Dungeons have their highs and lows. Some highs, there's over 100 of them. They look fantastic and vary wildly in themes. It was a very pleasant and startling surprise that can happen randomly in some dungeons. I won't spoil it, other than say it felt very nostalgic when it first happened, and the devs say they intend at looking at adding similar experiences in the future. Some lows, on the other hand, you can come across repeat bosses a lot. The layouts are somewhat predictable, and the objectives incentivize full dungeon clear, which can include a lot of backtracking. For example, you will commonly be required to somehow open a door midway through the dungeon, either by killing every single enemy in the section or having to do one side of the dungeon until you loot some kind of MacGuffin or doodad, bring it back to the door, then go to the opposite side of the dungeon and repeat the exercise to get a second MacGuffin, and likewise bring that back to the door. That's just 2 examples, but in both of them and in other dungeon types, you're required to run back through parts of the dungeon you've already cleared, which is less than great an experience. Game director Joe Shelley had this to say in a Eurogamer interview about it. We don't want players to be running through an empty dungeon. In cases where you're going to get a key and you're running back through an area, there should be enemies that are showing up to refresh that. It is a goal of ours that you're not running through an empty dungeon basically, ever. It can be okay for the very short periods of time. Now I can see what he's trying to say here, but at the same time, big who cares if you change it so monsters respawn through the parts that you've already cleared. I want to feel like I'm moving forward when I'm progressing through a dungeon, and as much as a first world problem that this may sound, it's still a little bit of a bummer, especially when players are going to be playing these dungeons again and again and again and repeatedly clearing them out as part of endgame content. Having said that, the endgame dungeons, nightmare dungeons, They add a lot of different modifications that could potentially overshadow that repetitiveness. The modifications have been data mined, and they do look pretty interesting and kind of gnarly for some of them. Inevitably though, we're going to have to see. Back on the overworld, you have world events. Some of them are a case of standing in a screen size zone, probably with another player or two, and kill monsters for some kind of objective. Maybe it's collecting souls for a jar, or standing on a specific spot in order to feed your blood to a creepy looking monolith. And then there are also slightly bigger events that trigger once you've completed a stronghold. Strongholds are a sort of mini dungeon on the overworld that you need to clear out monsters and a boss from. Once completed, the stronghold can change into another social hub with NPCs to trade with, or in the case of the beta, one of them turned into an event where once every hour or so, it could become infested with substantially higher leveled mobs, which then means they drop higher gear level loot. Specifically the one I'm talking about in the beta, one stronghold would spawn level 30 monsters, bearing in mind the level cap of the beta was level 25. A 5-minute warning was made to players in the zone, so it resulted in a large group of you playing together to clear it out. I liked it. It was rewarding and fun to see a bunch of players taking on the forces of Lilith in one big group. So 8 to 12 players to be clear. It was very MMO light. Speaking of MMO light, there are world bosses. In the beta, we got to fight against Ashava. Word on the grapevine is that Ashava is technically a level 45 world boss that has been scaled down to level 25 for the beta, so don't expect to fight them at level 25 on launch. You and 11 other players can take them on, however something for the devs to consider is that anyone can show up. Now the problem with this is only 12 players can show up on the same shard. So if you end up with some lobies in your shard, that means they are taking up the slot of someone who is actually the appropriate level, thus resulting in it being unlikely that you will complete the encounter due to insufficient damage because the event is timed. I took on Ashava 3 times throughout the beta, and the 3rd time was a wash because there were several players that were around level 13. Within the first 5 minutes, I knew we weren't going to kill it, as our group had not even took off a quarter of its HP, and that feels like a huge downer because it's something entirely out of my control, and I suspect there will be a largish time interval between each spawn. During the beta, Ashava spawned 4 times within 24 hours. This could of course change on launch. If it doesn't, then it's going to suck for those of us with full-time jobs or other commitments. To combat this, I think Blizzard needs to implement some kind of system where if a player is below a certain level in a world boss event, it either denies them access, which is a little harsh, I know, or it puts them on a shard with other players of the same level, allowing for level appropriate players to group up and not have their chances hindered by an overly inquisitive lobby. Another thing worth implementing is the means to make bigger parties, even if it's only for the world bosses. Being able to make a pre-made group of clanmates or friends beyond 4 players would certainly lessen the likelihood of this happening. Sure, some players may be a little gatekeepy about it, but then don't play with those types of players is what I would say. Either way, I hope it's something they're able to resolve for launch. That's enough about gameplay, let's move on to the skill system. Ooh boy, this might be a little polarizing for some. If you were to draw a spectrum of action RPG games, and on one end you put Diablo 3 representing the most casual and accessible game in the genre, and then on the other end you put Path of Exile, the game that is so complex and in-depth that brand new players to it start weeping and twitching in the fetal position as soon as they hit their first level up and open up the passive tree. And then slap bang in the middle I would put Last Epoch, which is for balance, where there's enough depth to entice and excite theory crafters and min-maxers, but there's not so much depth that it scares the hell out of casual and newer players to the genre. So where does Diablo 4 fall on this spectrum? And I would say about here. The thing is, Blizzard's MO has always been to take a genre, put it in a clean and well-built engine, and then open it up to a wider audience, a casual audience. There's a reason Diablo 3 was one of the top 10 best-selling games in the world. With that in mind, I knew not to expect a lot of depth when it came to the skill system. I'm not expecting a direct competitor to Path of Exile, although I do feel like the Paragon boards are a slightly less complex version of the passive skill system in PoE, so it could well scratch that itch for the theory crafters at endgame. Back on point though, the skill system is very shallow. In fact, you could argue there are less options and more restrictions than in Diablo 3. You can't just pick any skill you want once you're a high enough level, You are forced to follow a linear path starting with what they call basic skills, right down to your major passive at the very bottom of the tree. This means that potentially in late game, you are forced to pick abilities you don't really want, all in order to pump the line further down to unlock the ones that you do. For example, on my upheaval bar build, I got to the point where I didn't need a basic skill to generate Fury. It essentially generated Fury all on its own. However, I was obligated to spend 2 skill points in Lunging Strike in order to access the next node and skill into upheaval. Compare that to other modern action RPGs, and you come away with it feeling a little dated. In Diablo 3, in Last Epoch and Path of Exile, once I've reached a sufficient level, I can pick and choose whatever skills I want, leading to a far wider variety of builds from player to player. Now, I understand why they've gone for the structure that they have, because it's essentially a hidden tutorial. The system guides players through making a relatively viable build without directly telling them how to do so. However, this is a live service game. The point is to have those same players come back again and again and again, gaining knowledge and experience of those systems to the point where they should be able to confidently make their own builds, but that same system that taught them how to make those viable builds now shackles them from making more diverse and optimal builds. This could potentially be fixed by giving players the means to freely assign skill points once they've reached level 50. That way, you still guide players through the basic understanding of making viable builds, but then you are no longer shackled once you've gained that knowledge and experience and can truly put it to use. The ways you can modify your skills are very few and far between. In Path of Exile, you can manipulate a skill in 5 different ways, sometimes more, all at the same time. For example, you could take a skill that fires a single arrow projectile, but then it makes it into 3 projectiles, and then you make it ricochet. Then you make them have a higher crit, and then those crits have a chance to cast another skill, and so on. In Last Epoch, there are around 15 to 30 different passives to modify a skill, and that's per skill. Even in Diablo 3, you could pick a skill and change it in 8 different ways. In Diablo 4, there's 2. Just 2. Technically 3, but one of the passives is arbitrary in order to get to the other 2, which you can then only pick one of. This means if multiple people of the same class pick the same skill, it's likely 50% of you have spec'd into it in the exact same way, which personally makes the fantasy a little bit boring and less unique, a little dumbed down even. It almost feels like Blizzard doesn't trust me enough to make my own decisions with my build. Not only that, but you can clearly see the devs design the skills and their passives with builds already in mind. If you want to be a bleed barbarian, you pick all the bleed skills and the very distinctly dedicated to bleed passives. Whereas you can't modify another skill that you think is very cool, like upheaval or whirlwind or whatever, and then give that skill bleed. This means that each class essentially has around 4 playstyles in mind without giving the player that much freedom to break out of that. Now, to be fair, legendary aspects do play a lot into your builds. One legendary can change your build in a significant way, which does also mean that if you find a build-defining legendary, then you will probably be overcome with joy and feel a rush of excitement. However, it also means that interesting builds are heavily gear dependent, and the fun of making an exciting build is potentially hindered by RNG, and we all know that RNGesus can be very cruel. This won't be a problem for everyone, but it's worth considering, especially if you played the beta yourself and you're not aware that the drop rates were significantly increased compared to what they will be on launch. Now, all of this is more of a problem for hardcore fans of the genre. Hardcore as in they really like the game, not hardcore the mode, just to be clear. The system is otherwise going to be more than fine for casual players, but to reiterate, this is a live service game. Blizzard want you to come back again and again, and this system's design philosophy seems to be in direct contradiction to wanting players to make new builds each and every time over the course of a season or years to come even. Maybe they'll drastically change the skill meta each season. I don't know. I don't think so. Not drastically anyway, but I could be surprised. One last thing I want to mention is the druid specifically feels very gear dependent. The damage numbers are significantly weaker than other classes, and resource generation is an issue. We didn't have access to the spirit boon system, which does have a couple of options that could help, at least based on data mined info. However, we don't have the specific numbers, so I'm still a little skeptical how much a difference the boons will make. Unfortunately, this means the early game experience is not as fun as compared to other classes that can easily clear content without the need of a legendary to augment the build. I will give a more in-depth opinion on each class, but that's going to be part of the build videos that I'll be making. So do subscribe and keep an eye out for those in the near future. Now it's time to talk about loot. I've already covered some parts of this. Legendaries can be build defining. You have the means to stack aspects, which is the name of the special affix that legendaries have, to massively enhance one skill or multiple skills. You can also get the weakest versions of these aspects by completing dungeons, which thankfully reduces some of the dependency on good RNG. Equally, some of them are a bit underwhelming. This isn't necessarily bad, as lows can emphasize the highs, but just be prepared that your first legendary may be for a skill you have no intention of using, or it may simply be a little bit poo. Now, when it comes to the other affixes on the items, it is seemingly a little shallow. I say seemingly because I suspect, and I could be wrong, but I suspect we actually unlock other affixes as we increase in level. For example, I'm not sure if it's been removed, but in previous screenshots, Crushing Blow was an option, yet I didn't see it in the beta. I also didn't see the plus ultimate damage of affix until I was around level 20ish, hence my theory. I've seen a few folks remark that the itemization outside of aspects is a little boring and filled with dead stats, which I partially agree with. However, as I mentioned during the skill system segment, a lot of builds seem to have builds in mind, and I think at late game you may find yourself hyperfixating on specific stats like vulnerable damage or fortify or damage versus crowd control enemies and so on. Although I do sincerely hope I'm right about the pool of affixes expanding as you gain more levels. White and blue items are largely useless at a certain point. Admittedly, when that point will arrive is somewhat distorted by the increased drop rates in the beta, because it won't be raining legendaries and rares. Nonetheless, I do hope that they do more with white and blue items, maybe when they reintroduce rune words. Side note, they have taken rune words out of the game, at least temporarily, on the basis that the feedback said that the previous iteration they were going to go with was a little bit shit. But the devs have said that they intend on revisiting them in the future. Otherwise, like I said, white and blue items, especially in endgame, are just going to be salvage fodder. The crafting system is not a crafting system. It's more of a tweaking system. You cannot add affixes, you can only re-roll one. And once you do re-roll one affix, that is the only one you can re-roll on that item again. You can add sockets, which you can put gems in, which are a little bit boring to be honest. The main thing you can do is add legendary aspects to rares or swap them on legendaries you already have. Personally, I really like the idea of making my own items from a lower quality base, such as in Last Epoch or in Path of Exile. Hopefully they expand on this system, especially when they've added gathering and materials for crafting in the first place. Oh, and trading is limited to whites, blues, and rare items and gold only. It's a little bit more restrictive than I would like, because I really enjoy the idea of coming across an item that I have no intention of using, but I know it's valuable, and using that to then trade for an item that I've perhaps been really struggling to find. I think having a healthy and robust player economy can really help to diversify and expand on what builds people are willing to make, because it eases the chore of finding those items to experiment with. I understand that they want killing monsters to be the primary way to get loot, but I also suspect that this is their way of combating RMT or real money trading, and of course botting. But in my opinion, I think it's far better to find a real solution to those problems rather than removing or restricting a feature at the detriment to the gamer's experience. I think Last Epoch in particular are coming up with a yet to be seen but unique system, and I would really love for Blizzard to try and tackle the issue in the same way. All in all though, the itemization is fine, and you know, it's a live service game, so future updates, and we are listening to feedback and yada yada yada. This next segment is going to be a little short, as I intend to make a dedicated video about it and want to avoid spoilers, but let's talk story and writing. Holy shit, Diablo 3's writing was hot and sweaty garbage. I read the Sin War trilogy. I bought, owned, and read the Book of Cain. I watched the short form animated series. All of this prior to the release of Diablo 3, all purposely created by Blizzard in prep for the game's release, and thus I fell even more in love with Diablo's universe and its lore than I already was after playing Diablo 1 and 2. Then Diablo 3 happened, and they ignored fucking all of it. Deckard Cain got murked by a butterfly lady, Tyrael turned into a whiny, powerless bellend, act bosses had an inability of shutting the fuck up, constantly telling you that they'll get you next time like the villain from Inspector Gadget. Malthael's motive for wiping out humanity? Oh, it's because we're half demon. Oh, you just absorbed the Black Soul Stone into yourself? That's, you know, filled with the biggest, most powerful demons in history. Okay, hypocrite much. It was awful, just awful. And I don't like dunking on games like this, but for lore fans, Diablo 3's story was just so overwhelmingly disappointing. So I'm pleased to say, nay, overjoyed to announce that Diablo 4 is the opposite. Sure, we've only seen some of Act 1 and it could all go to hell. Get it? Hell? Anyway, it could go all to hell, but there is a noticeable shift in both tone and, frankly, writing ability. The writing feels like it's intended for adult audiences. Lilith is still a villainess, of course, but not like the cringy caricature type of villain we frequently saw in Diablo 3. Even side stories have more depth, and boy is it a lot darker. Like, my husband has developed a kink for being flayed darker. Seriously. Like I said, I don't want to go into too much details. I want to avoid spoilers. I'll be doing a dedicated story theory crafting video in the future. But yeah, Diablo 4's writing is good. Not masterclass, but it's good. And it's left me wanting to find out what happens to the characters that we meet and see where the story leads. Oh, before I forget, our characters have voice lines. I don't just mean pressing keys on the numpad to say things.
Thanks. Thank you. This is yours. This way. Time to die.
But actual dialogue in conversations with NPCs. I know not everyone will like that some folks prefer a silent protagonist so they can put their own headcanon behind their character's personality, and I get that. Sometimes I do too. But I liked the confident yet nonchalant lines that my character spoke. Okay, so I wanted to touch on this a little bit. When I say world design, I mean the feel of the world our characters are in, what impact the art style and the engine have on players. Diablo 4 is beautiful. Obviously, a lot of the landscape is bleak and dank and cold and wet and snowy. There were dungeons filled with whatever I do not want to fuck with types of terrain. There were piles of desiccated corpses in poorly lit prison-like dungeons. There was even a bit of scenery that looked like what I can only describe as a giant angry vagina. And it is all beautiful. The engine they've designed for this game is fantastic. There is hands down no prettier an action RPG on the market. Lost Ark, being a more of an MMO, is definitely pretty, but in a different way. In Diablo 4, everything looks realistic. There's also small yet important things that add to your immersion, like leaving trails in the snow as you walk. Even the wildlife does so. Parts of the environment are destructible, not just jars and barrels. For sure, none of this is groundbreaking and nothing we haven't seen before. And if anything, I do wish there was more interactions with the environment. In Path of Exile, for example, grass and bushes catch fire when using fire damage. Otherwise, none of the previous games in the series have made me stop and just appreciate the view like Diablo 4 does. The setting, much like the writing, is a little more grounded in reality, and thankfully the lighting makes a huge difference when compared to the feeling of Diablo 3. I've said this in the past, and to be clear, I didn't dislike Diablo 3's art style, but the lighting in Diablo 3 had a huge impact on the tone of the game. Everything glowed in the bloody dark. You'd enter an ice cavern with no lighting, and yet the rocks glowed blue. There were no shadows, just slightly darker shades of blue. In Diablo 2, and I think this is emphasized in Diablo 2 Resurrected, you had light radius, which meant the edges of the screen were bathed in darkness, so when monsters ran out at you, it felt like a lot more unsettling and more of a surprise. Diablo 4 doesn't quite do the same thing, but the lighting is a lot more realistic, resulting in darker dungeons and therefore having a much more horror-like ambient effect to it. Monster visual design likewise has this more realism approach to them, or at least as realistic as a corpse being puppeteered by a giant spider that explodes can have, I guess. I certainly prefer this change in direction from the previous game, and it seems to have gone down very well with the Diablo community overall. When it comes to the music, it's not bad. It's definitely not bad, but that's about as much as I have to say about it. In the previous games, even Diablo 3, which is my least favorite of the series, there were songs that I could really vibe to, music that really set the tone. Whereas in Diablo 4, and this could be as a result of the open world aspect, most of it was just ambient. There was no epic boss music for a Shava, for example, but there could be like really bombastic and sick music when you're playing the campaign, when you inevitably fight Lilith, for example, or any other act bosses. At the very least, from what I experienced in the beta, the music was okay. So, should you sell an organ to Mommy Lilith to buy Diablo 4? There are a couple of other things I want you to consider first. The entry price is a little steep, especially when you consider that competitors are either half the price or free. There's also going to be the cosmetic shop. People are rightfully skeptical of other monetization down the line thanks to Diablo Immortal, although I am personally optimistic based on how much the devs have hammered home the point that it will be cosmetic only. Also, the controversy would be huge if they went back on that, even more so than it was with Immortal. Then, of course, expansions are going to be paid for, whereas competitors, again, are free. And then you've also got to consider that they have set up the early access to fall on a weekend and then the official launch on a Tuesday. So, of course, you're going to lay down the extra money and pay for that. It just leaves a little bit of a dirty taste in the mouth, you know? However, maybe money's not an issue for you. Maybe you've heard everything I've said and you've gone, yes, that sounds fantastic. I'll buy 12, please. Personally, I am looking forward to the game and I can see myself spending thousands of hours within it. I do think there are some balancing issues and I hope there is going to be more depth and variety to the skill system. And I'm hoping that my theory is correct and itemization likewise has a little more depth. The game does feel great to play though, and to be fair, even if you're the sort of player who only intends to play through the campaign once, maybe you'll get a good build, experience all the dungeons, you know, 100% it or platinum it, that sort of thing. Even if you play it just that once, I'm pretty sure you're going to have well over 100 hours in your playthrough. Just in the beta, on my first character, I played a rogue. I did basically everything in that first zone and spent 20 to 25 hours on it. There are 5 zones. There are 4 world bosses. There's PvP. There's hundreds of dungeons. You're going to get your money's worth. Hopefully this video helps you to make an informed decision on whether or not you want to lay down the cash for the game. Was there anything that I didn't mention that you really liked in the beta if you played it yourself? Was there anything in the beta that you really disliked that I didn't mention? Leave it in a comment below. Otherwise, like the video, subscribe, set Lilith to your desktop and phone wallpapers, and thank you all very much for watching. Farewell. I'll remember you.
Next time, Captain.